Is one of the most basic principles of physics, one of Newton's laws. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And now, 1 month and 1 day into Donald Trump's second presidency, 1 month and 1 day since Donald Trump unleashed Elon Musk and his band of 20-something coders to gut the Justice Department and the FBI and the FAA and USAID and the Department of Homeland Security and the IRS and the VA and the Pentagon. 1 month and 1 day of Donald Trump terrifying and destabilizing our allies by cozying up to Vladimir Putin and insulting President Zelensky and claiming that he and Ukraine started the war. 1 month and 1 day of Donald Trump's administration deporting thousands of migrants, many of whom have no criminal record at all. 1 month and 1 day with no relief, none. Things going in the wrong direction on the question of inflation and the price of eggs. 1 month and 1 day of all that, we now have a better sense of what will oppose Donald Trump and his anti-democratic overreach, what Newton's law for every action and equal and opposite reaction might look like in our country and sounds like. Things like this.
Will you make sure hungry kids get fed and 5-year-olds aren't picking berries? Or are you going to...
I take education very seriously. I think AI can be transformative.
What are school lunches?
Why is this being jammed down the pipe so rushed and sloppily?
So,
Use a scalpel.
my understanding is when you say you have this many employees that you have to cut, that organization decides who they're going to cut. Now, they may make...
It's clear from all the writings of our founding fathers that our great republic was never meant to be ruled by a dictator nor a king.
A room full of ordinary voters who gathered at a town hall in Georgia last night to hear Republican Congressman Rich McCormick. And he's the one who got an earful from his constituents. He was greeted by boos and catcalls as hundreds of critics jeered his backing of President Donald Trump's agenda during his first month in office. Then there was this. A little bit ago, inside the White House State Dining Room, the Democratic governor of Maine refusing to back down when Donald Trump sought to bully and threaten her publicly over enforcing his administration's restrictions on transgender rights.
The NCAA has complied immediately, by the way. That's good. But I understand Maine. Is Maine here, the governor of Maine?
Yeah, I'm here.
Are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal law.
Well, we are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good, I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one. And enjoy your life after governor because I don't think you'll be in elected politics.
I will see you in court. But the most comprehensive and eloquent rebuke of Donald Trump's first month came from Illinois' Governor J.B. Pritzker.
We don't have kings in America, and I don't intend to bend the knee to one. If you think I'm overreacting and sounding the alarm too soon, consider this. It took the Nazis 1 month, 3 weeks, 2 days, 8 hours, and 40 minutes to dismantle a constitutional republic. And all I'm saying is that when the 5-alarm fire starts to burn, every good person better be ready to man a post with a bucket of water if you want to stop it from raging out of control. Tyranny requires your fear and your silence and your compliance. Democracy requires your courage. So gather your justice and humanity, Illinois, and do not let the tragic spirit of despair overcome us when our country needs us the most. Thank you.
Tyranny requires your fear and your silence and your compliance. Democracy requires your courage. That is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter Greg Bluestein is back with us. He was at that town hall we showed you first. Also joining us, former RNC spokesman and host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller's here. Puck News senior political columnist John Heilman is back. And with me at the table for the hour, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, the president of the National Action Network, the Reverend Al Sharpton, is here. Rev, I start with you because you know more than all of us combined about activism and about opposition and about holding elected officials' feet to the fire. That was just from the last 48 hours. What do you think?
I think we're seeing a rise in activism. We're seeing a groundswell of people that are saying, wait a minute, this is either not what I voted for, because some of these people are Trump supporters. The town hall with the congressman was not a blue district. And then others are saying that our worst fears have come alive. And when you start seeing thousands of people all over the country marching about the federal layoffs, and you see the town hall meetings, you're beginning to remember that what a lot of people forgot. When he went in 2016 and said he was going to end the Affordable Care Act and end Obamacare, it was this same organic rise up that we saw people at town hall meetings of their congressmen or congresswoman. People started rallying, people started marching, and it went all the way through. Then when George Floyd happened, all of us was out there. We're beginning to see the same kind of reaction to Donald Trump in his second term, and we're only in the third week.
Yeah. Tim Miller, the Bulwark has a great piece with a federal worker who voted for Donald Trump because he wanted his business acumen. And he's one of the federal workers who has been fired. And I think what's important about the piece is, and what's important about Rev's point about the town hall, is we speak with such despair as though the information silos are made of concrete and nothing gets through, one side or the other. That's been disproven in the last month. The things that Trump has done are abundantly clear to people who voted for him. And I wonder what you think of this moment.
It has. Well, I'm encouraged in this moment that some slumbering bears seem to have been awoken in the elected Democratic class, which is good, but also among people, and I think that it was rational and sensible for people to be disheartened after the election. I was disheartened. If this wasn't my job, I probably would have taken a month off too, and so I understand that. But eventually over time, we all knew, those of us who have watched Donald Trump closely, who are aware of his many bankruptcies and the fact that he left his first term, with the economy in tatters and, poop smeared on the Capitol, that he was going to have a similar result this time. And it was just going to be a matter of what and how. And we really are already seeing some of that. It is easy to demonize bureaucrats broadly. It is true that the federal government could be more efficient. But what is also true is that when you bring in somebody who has no expertise on this, who seems completely addled, who's wearing sunglasses and carrying a chainsaw at a conservative rally yesterday, and just have him willy-nilly fire a bunch of people, fire veterans, fire Trump supporters, fire people that contribute to their community without any review or any care about what happens to them, well, there's going to be negative political ramifications about that. Propaganda, the Fox propaganda machine and the other MAGA propaganda machines can't make people not feel what is really happening. And so I do think that, eventually over time, this stuff is going to continue to build as these guys continue to fail and flail, and they will.
Greg Bluestein, you were in the room. Tell us about this gathering of constituents and what they had to say to a Republican member of Congress.
Yeah, something that Rev said really struck me because it really did remind me of covering those Tea Party movement gatherings, those protests at town hall meetings 15 or so years ago. This, though, felt very organic. To my knowledge, there was not some big national effort behind this. Local parties and really local citizens were bubbling up from the grassroots level to go to this event. And hundreds were there. Many were there waiting outside and weren't even let in. It was cold. And so many of them kind of went home. But others were stuffed into overflow rooms. And there was a huge crowd in the actual room where the congressman was there, was delivering his remarks. And the pushback was real. I mean, this is the first time in Georgia since Trump's election where I've seen this amount of pushback in public There's been protests, there's been movements, but nothing like this before. And it reminds me too that, after Trump's election, a number of Georgia Democratic leaders said, look, we're in wait and see mode. We're going to wait and see what happens. It seems like the time to wait and see is long past right now, a month into Trump's term. So Democrats are really starting to push back.
And these, just to be clear, I mean, this looked like people who were disappointed that they had sent him there. I mean, this crowd seemed to at least represent themselves in their statements as, at least some of them voting for Donald Trump and the Republican congressman. Is that a fair read of what we heard?
Yeah, and look, some were Republicans, some were Democrats. This was sort of the tail end, the southern end of Congressman McCormick's district. He is not a MAGA warrior per se. He's not Marjorie Taylor Greene. He supported the president, and he's behind him, right now 100%. But originally, he supported Ron DeSantis, his presidential campaign. So he was maybe the most prominent Republican in Georgia, other than maybe Governor Kemp and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, not to support Donald Trump. Early on in his campaign. But at the same time, these were voters who were saying, hey, look, even though you say you're this independent maverick character, show it. And he's had a string of controversial and contentious statements that they wanted to hold him to account.
As I mentioned at the top of the show, we're following some breaking news this hour. Donald Trump has just fired General Charles Q. Brown, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the country's senior most military official. That job is essentially the president's top military advisor, and it usually holds over as administrations change. That's typically what happened. I mean, Joe Biden kept Trump's Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley until he stepped down at the end of 2023. Donald Trump decided to buck with that tradition, and I have to say the optics here don't look great. CQ Brown was only the second black man to ever hold that position, and he just got fired amid Trump's push to end programs promoting equality in the federal government. He will be replaced by retired three-star Air Force Lieutenant General Dan Kane. Courtney Kube is a senior NBC News correspondent covering national security and the Pentagon. Few people know more about what happens in that building than Courtney. Courtney, what we know at this point is limited amounts of reporting. There's obviously the Truth Social post from Donald Trump where he announces he's planning to nominate Air Force Lieutenant General Kane. I want to talk to you about that. But first, let me start by just asking you, what do we know about how he fired CQ Brown? Did he call him? Is there anything more we've learned about how this took place today?
Yeah, we know nothing about that, frankly. Now, we know CQ Brown was traveling. He had a trip to the border planned for today, and then he was supposed to travel on a little bit more domestically. So we know that trip went on, but beyond that, we just don't know. Look, here's the reality. We were expecting this to happen yesterday or today, so this isn't a huge surprise. We've been talking about the possibility of Lieutenant General Kane to replace the chairman. And just given the pattern of how this has been, the administration has been carrying out these sorts of things, we were all sort of expecting this to be on a Friday night. That being said, what we've gotten here are statements with no additional context to exactly what happened here. So we're still working through the details. This is all just breaking. And we've just gotten another statement, actually, from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, laying out some additional people who were fired here as well tonight.
Well, do you have that in front of you? Do you want to share with us the details of that, or we can also pull it up too? Please go ahead.
I do, and so I mean, there's so much to talk through here. Okay, so several of the people who were fired, according now to Secretary Hegseth, and the way that this has been laid out, I should say, is that they are looking for people to replace these individuals. They're not actually saying they were fired, but the reality is that's what's happening here. So the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, why that is an important person to mention here is she was the first woman to run the Navy, the first female Chief of Naval Operations, and critically now both of the women who were in positions running service chiefs, that is the Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard and now the Chief of Naval Operations, have now both been fired by President Donald Trump. Admiral Linda Fagan was fired within literally hours of Donald Trump being inaugurated, and now Lisa Franchetti. In addition to that, the Air Force Vice Chief of Staff, James Slife, also named tonight as being fired. There's no reason given for these, but the reality is General Slife has been someone who has promoted diversity issues within the Air Force, is known for that. That's candidly most likely why he was targeted. In addition to that, also several judge advocates general, JAGs, are also now set to be replaced, according to Pete Hegseth. But a little bit more on CQ Brown here. Look, we have heard from people very close to President Trump, including Secretary Hegseth. He wrote about in his book that he thought General Brown should be replaced as the chairman. We've also heard from the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, others who have been very outspoken about this. But we had some reporting back in December that General Brown, the chairman, had a good meeting with President Trump at the Army-Navy game, and the belief was he would have a little bit of time to be in this job. At this point, there is no indication that anything has happened from the time President Trump was inaugurated until CQ Brown was relieved of his job today that was merit-based. Any reason, anything that has happened that has led to this. And all indications are that this is the long-standing gripes that President Trump and many of the people around him have had with CQ Brown that have led to this decision tonight. The reality is CQ Brown has served honorably for 4 decades in the U.S. Air Force. He has thousands of hours as a pilot, as a fighter pilot, and he has served in senior jobs, including the head of the Air Force in the Middle East, in the Asia Pacific, the Air Force Chief of Staff, selected for that job by Donald Trump, I might add, and then now as the chairman for just over a year.
Courtney Kube, I know this news is just breaking. I so appreciate you taking the time. I know you're just reporting and trying to find out all the answers. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
I want to bring in NBC's Julie Sirkin, who's at CPAC in Maryland. NBC's Melanie Zanona is on Capitol Hill. Tim Miller is the host of the Bulwark podcast. He helped lead Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential campaign, and he's an MSNBC political analyst. And Eddie Glaude is a Princeton University professor and an MSNBC analyst as well. Mel, let's start with you, because we've seen this disconnect between the way GOP lawmakers are trying to assuage concerned constituents and then the way they talk on conservative media about DOJ and Trump's cuts. So how much longer can they continue to play both sides like this?
Yeah, the rubber is really meeting the road for a lot of these Republicans. Up until this point, I would say most Republicans on Capitol Hill have been publicly very supportive of the DOJ mission, right? And that was really easy to do when it was things like USAID or foreign aid that was on the chopping block. But now some of those cuts are starting to hit close to home for some of these lawmakers. There's a lot of federal workers in a lot of different parts of the country. There's a lot of concerns behind the scenes about slashes to things like officials working on the bird flu, for example, and how that might impact egg prices. And so behind the scenes, there's a lot of Republicans who have been back-channeling with the administration, raising alarm bells. I think they're really torn right now, especially when it comes to what they're going to say publicly, because they don't want to be seen as disloyal to Trump or crossing Trump and the DOJ mission, but they want to stand up and protect their constituents. And in a lot of cases, this is going to have to be a choice that ultimately they are going to have to make. And you're starting to see those angry town halls playing out in very ruby red districts across the country. This is something that could continue on as these cuts start to really impact different places. And I just don't think Republicans have quite figured out how to handle it yet.
Yeah, it's a rock and a hard place, but ultimately you're elected by your constituents to represent them. It's going to be a hard sell if they start saying they'd prefer to stay on the president's side versus the people who sent them to Washington. But Tim, I want to play a part of an exchange between our own Peter Alexander and the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. It's from this morning, and Peter asked her about town halls like the one we've been talking about. Watch.
We're now hearing from constituents in some traditionally red districts right now complaining about what they say is the chainsaw approach and saying that it's been done very sloppily, the cuts to jobs and spending. How do you respond to that criticism?
I love how the media takes a few critics when the overwhelming response from the American people is support for what this administration is doing. If you look at the public polling, 70% of Americans, according to CBS, believe that President Trump is delivering on the promises he made.
However dismissive this White House wants to be about its critics, people are feeling this. Lawmakers are hearing about it in lots of forums, not just in-person town halls. And for some of whom the layoffs are recent, what happens, Tim, after that last paycheck hits? How long do you think political ideology or the desire for a more efficient government is going to sustain people when they can't afford their groceries?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ellie, and it was a good question for Peter, though. I was hoping that you were going to play a different good question that he asked her about if they've caught a lot of fraud in Doge, where are the indictments? Because fraud is illegal, and she didn't have a good answer to that one either. But to your question, look, we are seeing some evidence of this, and it's going to take time to show up at scale. But we wrote about this in the Bulwark today. There was a 32-year Navy captain who got fired. He was the chief of staff for one of the regional FEMA operations. These kind of stories aren't going to wear well with people. Like with the richest guy in the world, a South African immigrant, arbitrarily and capriciously firing veterans who are serving the public to protect us when there are natural disasters. Once you start to actually put faces on the people that are doing a lot of these jobs, it's going to be much harder to defend than kind of the first shock and awe, so to speak, where you can just generically attack bureaucrats, right? Generically attacking bureaucrats is easy and popular. Attacking veterans who lost their job, not so much.
Yeah, exactly. The idea of a faceless government bureaucracy versus your friends and neighbors who are trying to provide for their families while also serving this country. It's a really important point there, Tim. Eddie, as we heard from these people in Georgia and Oregon, it's not the idea of saving money or a desire for efficiency that's actually got them upset. It's the way that this is being handled. So is there a message that the White House can take from that it's the blunt instrument approach that people are in large part being upset by?
Well, one would hope if they were actually concerned about what actual everyday ordinary people are thinking. Right now, they're like a bull in a china shop. The constituencies, their base is asking for a more directed, a more precision-based kind of approach. But what we do know is this, and Tim and others have made the point, they're not concerned about the human cost. They're only concerned about these abstract questions of efficiency, of deconstructing the administrative state. What does it mean that all of these people suddenly have to think about how they're going to pay their mortgage, how they're going to put food on the table for their kids, how they're going to pay for college, right? And it's not like a localized layoff. This is the federal government. So it's going to impact people across the country. And the thing is that what we're clear about, Allie, is that they don't really care. They're just going to pursue their agenda. But hopefully the constituent base will make the representatives who they elect care, because the folks, Elon Musk and Donald Trump, don't seem to.
Yeah, this is truly a moment where the grassroots, I think, could have an impact. Meanwhile, as this is happening, Julie, you've got Elon Musk, the face of all of these cuts, going to CPAC and literally wielding a chainsaw inscribed with the phrase, "Long live liberty, damn it." The ad sort of writes itself for Democrats on this one. You see the image there on the screen. But what was the reaction in the room? Because you're with a group of people who are the conservative grassroots.
Yeah, but in here, Allie, as you know, this year's CPAC is really a victory lap for Trump and his allies. So the crowd here ate that moment up. It was probably the most energetic that we saw them all day long. And I'll tell you, House Speaker Mike Johnson, Senator Eric Schmidt, Senator Rick Scott, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, all praised Musk efforts, all praised the Doge efforts as well. This is what Musk, though, had to say when he was on stage and what he's discovered in his first few weeks as apparently the head of this department. Watch.
People ask me, what's the most surprising thing that you've encountered when you go to D.C., when you're in D.C.? And I said, well, the most surprising thing is the scale of the expenditures and actually how easy it is to, when you add caring and competence where it was absent before, you can actually save billions of dollars, sometimes in an hour. Yeah. It's wild.
I'm not quite sure that has happened yet. Certainly there are Doge committees on the Hill in the House and Senate. This is an area that really Congress is supposed to be in charge of, that they're frankly uniquely bad at over the last few years, especially adding to the deficit. Even now in the budget resolution that the Senate passed last night, more funding for immigration, for military, for energy. And meanwhile, as Musk is trying to cut a lot from the budget. Now, it was an interesting moment earlier when House Speaker Mike Johnson, as Melanie knows well, said that they would not be touching Medicaid. They won't be cutting that program. They won't be cutting SNAP benefits as well. Musk said they will be cutting those programs. And it's just that kind of tightrope that Republicans are having to walk while they don't want to necessarily push away the Trump administration in these early days of his second term. But at the same time, they're hearing from constituents back home in those town halls and those red districts that Mel was talking about. And so I think it's going to come to a head very, very soon here in D.C. when they come back next week.
Yeah, Mel, Julie teased you up nicely because it wasn't the only moment of dissonance that the speaker endured between him and Musk, even at CPAC alone, because Musk and the president have also floated the idea of Doge dividends. Speaker Johnson came in, though, with a fiscal reality check of sorts. Watch.
Politically, that would be great for us, because then everybody would check. But really, we have to think of it, I think, in a...
That just got everybody's attention, by the way.
Yeah, I know.
I just saw everybody look up all of a sudden.
I know.
Yep.
But if you think about our core principles, right, fiscal responsibility is what we do as conservatives. That's our brand. And we have a $36 trillion federal debt. We have a giant deficit that we're contending with. I think we need to pay down the credit card, right? That's what I think we need to do.
Speaker Johnson there, Mel, basically saying, hey, guys, remember, we're conservatives. Do you think he's going to get his way on this, though?
Well, Allie, as you know, and as Julie knows very well, having covered Capitol Hill, Trump does tend to get his way around here. Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if ultimately that is what happens. But let me explain to you why this is such a big problem for Johnson. Because in the House, they are trying to pass this budget plan, and they are trying to enact some very steep spending cuts and trying to get fiscal conservatives to come along. And there was some hope that some of the Doge savings could be scored, and that could maybe not formally add to the level of cuts that they're going to write in their bill, but it could at least assuage some of these skeptical fiscal hawks, some of these hardline conservatives, into backing a package that might be a little bit more expensive than they otherwise would have. So without those Doge savings, if those go out the door in the form of checks, that could complicate Mike Johnson's life here on Capitol Hill. But this is just another great example of how the cracks in the GOP's support of Doge are really starting to form.
Tim, I want to just stay on the idea of Doge dividends for a few more seconds if we can, because we don't have any idea if these checks would even work, how much they would even be for. Doge is completely untransparent in the work that it's actually doing. But is there any political risk to floating these kinds of checks if they aren't a sure thing?
Well, I mean, there's some political risk to Mike Johnson. You just look at those two videos there of Elon Musk with the sunglasses and the chainsaw and everybody screaming. And then you have poor schoolmarm Mike Johnson being like, remember, guys, remember our principles. We've got to pay down the debt. You can see why one is more appealing than the other politically. But the reality is that they are in a bind with regards to the budget, even without paying Doge dividends. I mean, the budget they put out with extending the Trump tax cuts and no tax on tips, even with the Doge cuts, still adds another $3.5 trillion to the debt. And Trump added more to the debt in his first term than any other president in our history. And so, Mike Johnson, I think, is going to have a tough sell talking about fiscal responsibility, given the obligations that they have and the promises Trump has made with the tax cuts, in addition to this now floated dividend.
Joining us now, NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, our Melanie Zanona from Capitol Hill, New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker, and former Republican Congressman of Pennsylvania Charlie Dent. Gabe, let's start with these IRS cuts. How many jobs are we talking, and what's the impact? It's tax season. People need those tax return checks.
Hi there, Anna. Good morning. Well, the numbers have been a bit all over the place. Hard to pin down exactly how many, but the president's top economic advisors say that the number of job cuts at the IRS will exceed 3,500. And some of those workers that are already being laid off say that this could impact your tax season and how quickly you get that tax refund, because some of this work could get backed up. Now, as you mentioned, Anna, the president and his administration now getting some backlash in several of these town halls that we're seeing across the country. But just this morning, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, speaking with my colleague Peter Alexander, pushed back on this criticism, saying that the vast majority of Americans, in their view, support what the president is doing and that he is delivering on something that he campaigned on, Anna.
And we're working to get that sound and turn for our viewers. Melanie, let's talk about the backlash some of these Republican lawmakers are now facing at home over the Doge actions. What more can you tell us about it?
Yeah, Republicans are really starting to feel the heat over some of these Doge cuts and these Doge actions. It was one thing when it was USAID or foreign aid that was on the chopping block, but as these cuts have started to hit close to home, Republicans are starting to really feel the heat. And there were a number of town halls this week where Republicans in the House who are home for recess were confronted by angry constituents at town halls. And one of them was particularly notable. Richard McCormick, he's a Georgia Republican. He represents a district that Trump won by 22 percentage points. And he was booed, he was catcalled, and he was grilled by his constituents about what he was going to do to stand up to the Trump administration. And at times, he got combative with his constituents. Take a listen.
funny thing is, you're sitting here and a lot of you would probably say those January 6s who are yelling just as loud as you. I've seen Game of Thrones too, thank you. Let's go ahead and move on because...
And so this has some echoes of the 2010 Tea Party movement, a fiscal conservative movement that originated in town halls, just like the one you saw there, except in that instance, the roles were reversed for Republicans and Democrats. But I just think Republicans in this moment are really struggling with how do they protect their constituents without being seen as disloyal to Donald Trump.
So, Peter, publicly it seems these Republican lawmakers are towing the Trump line. But even if some are privately expressing concerns with the White House, does it matter? Do they have any leverage to make Trump change his approach?
No, I mean, not in the short term, obviously. If politically this becomes toxic, obviously that may force a recalibration. But for the moment, no. Trump is more than happy to have this sort of image of chaos, the image you showed of Elon Musk with the chainsaw. It's about entertainment, right? I mean, you know, if you're having a serious, informed conversation about how to shrink the scale and size of government, appearing on stage with a giant chainsaw is not the way to do it. That's all about entertainment, and they like this image because it satisfies Trump's desire to attack the deep state. That's what he said he would do during the campaign. And so his argument is he's doing exactly what he told voters he would do and voters wanted him to do. Now, a lot of his own voters, I think, may have misunderstood exactly how he would go about doing it, because a lot of things that are going to end up being cut are things that affect their lives. And I think that you see all that, you know, right now, the Grand Canyon, you know, you see that with the IRS cuts. I mean, this could have impact on people's daily lives. People forget at times how much the government really does for them. And there are things that they don't want government to do, but there are a lot of things that they do want government to do.
I can only imagine how the thousands of people who've lost their jobs feel seeing that image of Elon Musk with the chainsaw, proudly holding it up and wielding it around as if this is such entertainment, Congressman. As Melanie mentioned, that Georgia town hall was in a district Trump won by 22 points. You're hearing that anger in those communities. If you're a GOP lawmaker right now getting an earful from your constituents, what do you do?
Well, I would tell them to look back at the tape from 2017 during the health care town halls when many Republicans were being hammered at the time of the Obamacare repeal replace movement. And that's what it feels like now, that Republicans realize that they are in a very defensive position, that what Musk and Trump are doing through Doge is having real consequences across the country. And many of these Republicans now are forced into a position: do they side with Donald Trump, or do they side with the constituents in their districts, you know, who have lost their jobs? And so this is a really tough moment, but this feels so much like 2017. I can't begin to tell you. And even a Republican in the district like you described, where he won by 22 or 24 points, some of these districts are going to be competitive in 2020, in the 2026 midterm. So some of these folks who think they're safe right now and in very safe Trump districts are going to find out they're not that safe. And that's what we saw in the 2018 midterm. If I were a Republican, I'd buckle up and get ready.
Greg Bluestein's the person who took some of that video. He's a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and he reports that McCormick's staff seemed caught off guard by the massive crowd of hundreds that had gathered for this event. Congressman Dent, do you get the sense that Republicans in Washington are sort of living in a bubble right now regarding Doge, and that this backlash really is catching them off guard?
Well, I think the smart ones understand it. When you see Republicans in Idaho push back on cuts to the National Park Service, where tourism is a big industry at the national parks there, in Alabama, where they're worried about cuts to the NIH through this indirect cost recovery cap. That's going on. Obviously, we just saw it in Georgia with layoffs at the CDC. So I think smart Republicans realize that they are in a very delicate position, that Elon Musk's behavior yesterday at CPAC, by the way, CPAC has always been a freak show in my view. It's been where the fringe goes to meet, and now some of the fringe are mainstream, but that was a terrible image. They're going to have to defend that. And that town hall you saw yesterday is likely to be replicated all across the country. And I suspect many members will not be holding town halls just because of that experience.
I mean, the split screen we're seeing in these two images from the town hall to CPAC is really something. Gabe, it appears a lot of the anger, at least at this point, is directed at Elon Musk. I wonder, does that buffer President Trump from blowback? Is the White House feeling the pressure at all?
No, Anna, the White House is not feeling any pressure, at least publicly. That's what they're saying. Again, Caroline Leavitt this morning doubling down and saying that this is what Donald Trump's voters wanted him to do. And yesterday at the White House press briefing, there were several top officials from the administration defending Elon Musk and repeating that it is President Trump that is in charge of all this. And they do not seem dissuaded at all by this blowback that we're seeing at some of those town halls. You saw Elon Musk yesterday at CPAC with that chainsaw, and that is an image that this administration wants. They want to keep hitting that point that they are trying to cut waste, fraud, and abuse as they see it. Of course, they have yet to provide any evidence of widespread fraud, but they're taking the posture that anyone that is criticizing this, including members of the press, they say, must somehow be opposed to cutting waste in the government. Still, there are certainly, as you've been reporting, human lives at risk here, jobs at risk here, and it should be interesting to see over the coming days whether the White House feels any of that. At this point, though, they still seem to be saying full steam ahead on.
And Mel, as thousands of federal workers are seeing their jobs disappear, Senate Republicans just pulled an all-nighter. They passed a bill that would add billions to the budget. Tell us about that vote-a-rama.
Yeah, that was an all-night exercise because senators are allowed to offer an unlimited amount of amendments. So Democrats use this as a messaging opportunity so that they could try to force some tough votes for Republicans to try to divide the GOP. And they did have some success. There was one notable amendment that would bar tax breaks and tax cuts for the wealthy if any money is cut from Medicaid. And there were two Republicans, Susan Collins and Josh Hawley, who both voted for that amendment. But it was a largely messaging effort. It was largely symbolic. The real test is going to come in the weeks and months ahead because the House and Senate first need to agree on a budget, and the House is pushing ahead with a very different version next week. And then once they agree, they're going to have to actually get to writing the policy, and that's where it's going to get very complicated. They're looking for steep spending cuts. They're trying to implement Donald Trump's complicated, large tax agenda, all these different priorities, and so that's going to be something that they're going to really have to deal with in these coming weeks here.
Senator Rand Paul was the only Republican to vote against that budget resolution overnight. Here's his reasoning.
If we were fiscally conservative, why wouldn't we take the savings from Elon Musk and Doge and move it over here and help with the border? Why would we be doing a brand new bill to increase spending by $340 billion?
Peter, your read on that?
Well, look, the truth is there is a serious fiscal issue in this country. The annual deficit is approaching $2 trillion. No question that that's something that neither party has confronted in a serious way for a number of years. But the Doge effort is not about actually addressing that because it's really at the margins. You fire a few thousand people here or there. That's not where the real fiscal imbalance is. The real problem with the federal government right now are issues like Social Security, the Defense Department, Medicare, Medicaid, all of which Donald Trump has more or less said he's not going to touch. Well, if you don't touch those, it's going to be really hard to get meaningful savings that would actually put the budget anywhere close to balance, especially then you add to the deficit with massive tax cuts. So the real serious effort is not what Elon Musk is doing. That's about messaging, as we just talked about. That's actually about appearances in some ways, but with actual consequences. It won't actually solve the budget issue, but it does have real consequences for real people and real programs.
The middle of tax season and sweeping layoffs at the IRS. Take a look at some of the headlines nationwide, from Philadelphia to Kansas City, Denver, and parts of Florida. The shock of those cuts is only just now starting to sink in.
I'm just kind of lost because this was like my plan.
Heartbreaking. Because we all wanted the job.
Yeah, it's hard, you know. We got bills, we got kids to take care of, you know, daycares. And
they're firing people, and I thought we were short-staffed, and now you're firing us? That makes no sense.
I want to bring in the chapter president for the National Treasury Employees Union, Kansas City chapter, Shannon Ellis. She represents IRS workers there. Shannon, we saw a lot of raw emotions there, a wide range. Can you tell us what you're hearing from the people that you represent and how many of them were impacted by these cuts?
Well, nationwide, we're being told around 6,000 in this round. Here locally, we're somewhere around 100. We don't know the exact counts. Today we had received notice that they thought everybody that was listed to be terminated today, it was over. We possibly had one coming Monday, and then another complete team of new hires was brought down. So, these employees they're angry, they're scared because they don't know what they're going to do, frustrated, confused, and very, very, very upset and emotional over it. This is nothing like I've ever seen before.
Is one of the fears on top of that it's happening in a seemingly haphazard way and you don't actually know when the end of the firings are?
Yes, the group that came down today, they had no idea. They were in training. They had not received any kind of a notification. Literally, a manager came to their team into their training room and told them that they were being removed today. And, I just want to make this clear. This is not a layoff. A layoff implies that we would be back, after, as work picks up. This is a firing. This is termination of these employees. And without any kind of notice whatsoever, they just can't plan for it. It's totally unexpected. Yesterday, we watched employees set from 6 a.m. until 2:30 or 3:30 in the afternoon, told only that they were to set and wait for an email to come, where that email never did come. And then later they were told, well, we're going to mail it to you. These employees are walking out the door without anything in their hand that says that they were terminated. So even to try to go do unemployment or anything, they have nothing.
Are there severance packages being included in these firings?
No, and that's the part that's most frustrating, is that if this was a reduction in force or to reduce our workforce, there are procedures to be filed and followed. These employees would be either moved to areas where we need them more. We would be paying severance packages. We would be doing buyouts for those that are close to retirement. None of that is being followed. And these employees are most upset about the fact that they're being tossed out as if they have done something wrong. And these employees are fully successful and or just coming into training. We have employees that are just within a week of being finished with this probationary period. They've completed all their training and they are able to do their job. And so for you to toss them out and try to imply that these employees are being let go because of their performance, it's insulting.
Is there any recourse, any way for these folks to try to fight to get their jobs back?
Well, when they finally do receive a letter that terminates them, there are appeal rights, but they have limited reasons that they can use for the appeal. I know that NTEU National, we are filing lawsuits. We're going to do everything in every avenue to try to fight this and bring these employees back. In our opinion, this is done illegally and it's unconstitutional. These employees were needed, and we absolutely have been underfunded and understaffed for over 15 years with the Internal Revenue Service. These employees are needed to do the job.
And they're needed at the height of tax season, which is right now. Americans across the country are filing their taxes. So how could these cuts impact them at this point?
Well, I mean, it can definitely delay the filing, the refunds. A lot of these were answering phones. We hear all the time taxpayers are upset because they can't get through to some of the phone lines. Well, you're taking more and more of our workforce away So, it is going to impact them immediately on every avenue. We just can't, there's no way to say how important these jobs were. We've got areas that are working 7 days a week to keep up with what's coming in, and we're not even in the middle of the tax season yet.
Impacting the workers, impacting the taxpayers. Shannon Ellis, thank you for joining us today.